Hi, welcome to Postgres Vision 2020. We're delighted to have you join us over the next few days. It's remarkable to think about how much has changed in the past year. It was just a year ago in Boston when we gathered to talk about the future of Postgres, and here we find ourselves a year later amidst the global pandemic and a world that seemingly changed again. And I want to extend my best wishes to all of you and your families, your loved ones, your friends, in hopes that you are staying safe and healthy amidst the global pandemic. You know, it's interesting to me as we gather now, particularly under these circumstances, that, you know, we've talked about so much change that's happening in our environment currently. And it's so notable because of the issues, the health issues that we face around the world. And I think also notable because those very issues have had a dramatic impact on our businesses and our livelihood. And it's reflected in the markets and the volatility and turmoil we see there. But it's a reminder, I think, of the conditions of existence for the future. And that is that change will be constant, that change is normal. And as we think about what the implications are for those kind of environments, you know, we have to be thinking about our role and responsibility in our businesses and our organizations and the role we play as technology leaders. And I do think that our concept of the way we manage businesses and the way we think about the use of technology and infrastructure has to change. We've been saying that for some time, and many of you have been deploying Postgres and open source successfully as part of that change. But the reality is, I think now more than ever, our businesses are fighting for financial independence and fighting for financial power. And that fight happens at the expense of the big incumbent vendors that live inside of our P&Ls. And I think it speaks to our time for revolution. And I think we're in that revolution, and we see it so clearly taking shape in the technology landscape as we endeavor to do things more efficiently and more effectively. And that transformation really has a huge impact on the nature of how we run technology operations. And I think for that to take shape, you have to have the kind of technologies and business partners that enable you to transform and to be different and to be part of the revolution that changes the face of your business. I want to compare the revolution we're in today to the Industrial Revolution, which, as many of you may know from history, the Industrial Revolution brought fundamental changes in businesses and frankly in the world. And that transformation took shape over a number of years from, I think, roughly the 1760s into the 1820s. Some might even say into up to as late as 1840. And it was the transformation around handmade work to machine production. It was a transformation that saw the introduction of iron production. It was the transformation that saw us embrace more of water power and steam power. And I want to dig in a little bit further to steam power because I think there's some interesting parallels to the development there that we see in our world today. Let me talk to you about the story of James Watt. So many of you likely know of James Watt, but not because of who he is. You probably are familiar with Watt as an expression or a measure of power. Well, that measure of power is actually associated with the man who's responsible for creating some of the new standards that we experience in the modern world. He is known as a hero and business leader in the Industrial Revolution, but what he was most notable for was his work in making steam engines more efficient and turning them into the workhorse that we knew them to be in the modern era. In fact, he was so advanced in the way he approached improving the steam engine that he actually coined the term horsepower So he's notable in history for bringing us the watt and also bringing us the concept of horsepower. But what lived underneath that was a body of work that really was James Watt supercharging the steam engine. And it's a concept I think is important to dig into. So there were early inventors and names you probably have not heard before. You might ask, so what happened to them? You know, at the top, Otto von Guericke. He was born in the 1600s, and he actually was the inventor of the vacuum pump, which was necessary to start the process of building engines that could take advantage of steam. Thomas Newcomen, Thomas Savery built the first steam pump, and it was designed to pump water, but he designed something that was basically able to turn boiling water into vapor that could be converted to power. And then Thomas Newcomen came along, and he actually enhanced that design by Thomas Savery, and he was able to introduce atmospheric steam into the engine, which allowed for the intensity of pressure to go less limited by the pressure of the steam. So what I find interesting is all of those inventors were really important to the development of power and the development of the steam engine, but we really don't know much about them, as opposed to James Watt, who really created a more fundamental transformation. And so, you know, the question is, what happened? Why were those inventors, what made those inventors different? One of the things that made those inventors different is the concepts that they were focused on were important, but pretty specialized. You know, Newcomen and Savery were focused on pumping water out of something. In fact, they were used, their steam pumps were well known to be used in pumping water out of excavated mines, so the mines could continue to be developed. There are big structures that were built in place. What changed was that Watt realized that those engines lacked efficiency and didn't take advantage of the energy they could. And so he introduced a design that radically changed that mechanic and improved also the efficiency and cost effectiveness of those designs by enabling those very steam engines to be mobile so that they could actually be transported to sites and applied in a different context. And that's how we saw the role of the steam engine actually grow and become much more useful in a wider range of applications. And I think this really illustrates one of the most important differences that we can draw parallel to today in the database world. And in the early cases, you know, the early inventors had invented important things. They'd created something meaningful. But if you put it on a scale and you look at it in the context of the degree of specialization, where the two measures are highly specialized or general purpose, and you look at the number of people who benefit from the technology, I mean, you clearly see that while those early inventors of steam engines did really important work, the work they did was focused on a specialized application. Whereas Watt came in and saw deficiencies and had a bigger view of how to automate that capability and build it in such a way that it could be delivered to the masses. And the amount of people that benefited grew exponentially. And that's why we know Watt. That's why we know of the importance of his work. And so I think there's parallels as we look at the 20th century, and particularly look at the transformation of database and compute in general. So let's jump there. Many of you know, we won't go into the history of the origins of the relational database, which I think many of you likely know. In 1970, E.F. Codd, who was at IBM, developed a relational model of database for large shared data banks. That was the thesis paper that was really the founding of the work that we think of today in the relational database market. In 1974, that was turned into System R at IBM. But I think credit for the first real commercial relational database, although there were examples before this, comes in 1979 by a company who launched the first commercial relational database. The company was known then as Relational Software. You may know them today as Oracle. And when we think about those transformations and we put it in the modern context, I mean, let's fast forward to where we are today. Much like the early development in the steam engine, those database technologies are good, very good, but they just don't seem to be enough for the modern needs we have in enterprise. You know, we've watched significant relational database innovations come along that add power to the database, just like Watt did to the steam engine. But I think many of those technical advancements, while important, haven't been enough, because as we pursue a much broader application of technology across business, the expense of that infrastructure and those platforms becomes prohibitive to the growth of the use of technology and the need of technology that we find in the companies we run today. And it's, I think, at that intersection that we have the fundamental conflict. Now, there's also improvements we've seen in technology, particularly in database, not just in the general purpose relational databases that we're familiar with, but also in the introduction of a number of specialty databases. And I'll come back and talk about that in a minute. But the world has fundamentally changed. And so the requirements of the masses look different than they did in 1970, when the concept of relational database was invented. And I think one of the most important transformations has been the entrance of open source technologies and databases to the industry. I've been in open source now for 20 years, starting at Red Hat and now here at Enterprise DB. And I can tell you that we've witnessed in that time a shocking transformation of the application of technology for broad scale use across enterprise. Technology that's no longer simply the domain of an IT organization, but rather business units across enterprise that demand professionals in the entire organization are technically competent and able to build applications that serve increasing business needs. And I think when we look at open source and the impact it's had, we are still at the relatively early stages, at least in the database landscape, of seeing those technologies really create fundamental change and fundamental transformation. I would tell you also that I think we've seen the concept of open source evolve. And I think this is important. You know, there are a number of open source technologies and database technologies available in the market today. There are very few that are true independent open source projects. Proudly, Postgres is one of those. And I'll come back to talk about this as we go on later. But again, you know, think about well-known infrastructure software projects that are based on open source and are independent. Linux is the most obvious and most notable one. The great work that Red Hat and now IBM are doing with Linux, it remains a really important part of what's made Linux successful, but Linux is an independent project. I think alongside that, more recently, Kubernetes as an independent open source project, not controlled by a single company. And you have to put in that short list Postgres, a vibrant, vital community that isn't controlled by a company. And that's what gives it its strength. Let's contrast that. MySQL is owned by Oracle. MongoDB, the community is owned by MongoDB, the company. These aren't independent projects. Now, they may in fact be open source, but the real value of community development, the real value of independence comes from truly independent nature of the project itself. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So where are we on the evolution of open source database? There's been an incredible wave of adoption. And I think we've seen Gartner's State of Open Source Database Market from in 2019 said that by 2020, more than 70% of new in-house applications will be developed on an open source database. Think about that. That's 2022, more than 70%. That's a shocking number. Now, we stare at that closely here at EDB, and I can tell you that that pattern of adoption is happening, and we see it accelerating. By 2022, 50% of existing proprietary relational DBMSs will have been converted or be in the process of converting to open source. So not only are we seeing a transformation in the very nature of the way new applications are being developed, but we're also seeing a shocking migration away from traditional proprietary databases. When we talk about this being a transformation, this being a revolution, these are the seeds of revolution that are taking place in the database market. And look at it through a slightly different lens, and this is true for EDB. As we look across the world, 50% of enterprises in Asia Pacific use open source databases today. So there are a remarkable number of points of evidence that tell us what's happening in the market. And you know what? That may not be news to you. It may be common understanding, certainly to this audience, that it's true. But I think it's important to reflect on it because we still see a preponderance of customers and users who are struggling with the path and pattern to pursue to move away from some of the traditional methods they've used in the past. And that's what we're here to help with. A big part of the problems that we see companies addressing is how to break free from the incumbent relationships they have. And let's start with the obvious ones. They have gnarly contracts that are incredibly restrictive, incredibly punitive, and burdensome. And we see it time and time again. In addition to architecting great sticky database products, the big proprietary vendors have architected incredibly powerful contracts that lock their customers in. And so part of a transformation and part of what has to happen in this revolution is people have to break away from these contracts. And we note it in particular with Oracle customers who are absolutely fed up with the burdensome nature of those agreements and fighting hard to change the nature of their commercial relationships with their database partners. The second area that we see is one that we are all so close to today, and that is the breaking free of the notion and the traditional confinement of a data center. That's been in change for some time, but let's face it, we still see an incredible amount of workload running in a traditional data center context, while all of us in every enterprise and government is working to find a way to deploy an entirely new context. And those transformations require heavy lifting, both in terms of the nature of governance and how technology, infrastructure, and platforms are managed and monitored, but also in the context of the cost to make those changes and to grow in the future in a new context. And then I think, real transformation is not just about technology. I think it truly lives. It lives at the intersection of technology that has reach to address a wide range of needs that enterprise have. So it's the ability of technology with reach and technology that delivers economic value for the many. And I think this is where we see the opportunity for Postgres exploding. Postgres has created a true economic transformation in enterprise. And I think it's fundamentally changing the economics of enterprise and IT. And I want to talk about that in a bit more detail. You know, I guess the question is, why is Postgres such an important game changer? I mean, we have seen that Postgres, we know that Postgres offers a shocking economic advantage, you know, a 10-to-1 advantage compared to commercial proprietary software, at least a 10-to-1 advantage, maybe more. We also know that in the world of developers, it's been highly regarded for being the most loved, most used, most respected database. So let's go into what that really looks like. One of the important reasons Postgres has been a game changer is because it's available everywhere. And this really speaks to, in part, the importance of Postgres being an independent open source project and the nature of the Postgres license, which is a true free and open source license with no restrictions. And I think it's enabled Postgres to get much more traction across in many more environments. And so we see Postgres now the database of choice by public cloud vendors and by customers in public cloud. And I think that happened for very specific reasons. Started with tech, but continued largely because of the nature of that community and the licensing arrangement. But one of the things that makes Postgres transformational is that it is everywhere and you can deploy it everywhere. And I'm going to come back to that because it's a priority for EDB to help you make use of Postgres wherever you want to deploy it. But let's talk about Postgres for builders. And builders, think of builders in the context of C-level executives, architects, technology leaders in data management and database, DBAs. So why do you pick Postgres to build your future? I think there's 4 reasons. And I think they may seem pretty obvious. The first, I think Postgres, as everyone here may likely know, is world-class database technology with the features, the performance, the capabilities that any enterprise would need to be successful in developing their applications. I think the second is Postgres is developed by a robust, independent, open source project. And I will differentiate it again from Mongo, which is not independent, from MySQL, which is owned by Oracle. There really is not a community like Postgres in the database category today. I think the third is there's a fast growing ecosystem that allows enterprises to intersect many parts of their business, from SaaS to ISVs to SIs. And some examples, you know, we're doing an incredible amount of work with IBM, who's standardizing on EDB and Postgres across many of their platforms in data and AI, in cloud, and making incredible strides in intersecting that great technology with their expertise with customers and bringing value together in that context. Other companies that standardize on Postgres, like Atlassian, in all the Jira apps, for example, Kronos, Ericsson, in the SI world, Accenture, Infosys, Tech Mahindra, Wipro, TCS, all firms that are exploiting and leveraging the advantages of Postgres. The ecosystem of vendors that support Postgres now is strong and growing at an accelerating rate. And then I think the last is in deployments, where you can take Postgres and deploy it in any context of your choosing. Now, there are some caveats there. There are cloud vendors that have developed their own proprietary versions of Postgres that are less compatible if you move away from their cloud platform. And I think that poses some potential risks. But one of the things that we strive to do is to put business customers, enterprises in a position to deploy the same Postgres in any context, on any platform, whether that be in the traditional data center, on traditional bare metal, in virtual machines, in containers, in public cloud, in any public cloud, but do that in the context of a single instance and implementation of Postgres. So those, I think, are the reasons why builders should pick Postgres. And let's face it, Postgres has gotten faster and better over time. I think that means that developers specifically can go further with Postgres than they have before. I mean, now Postgres, for those of you who are close to the technology like we are, we've seen Postgres performance improve dramatically over the past several years. We're proud to be primary contributors to the community in helping make Postgres faster, more secure, more scalable. But what's interesting, I think many of you may have looked at in the past the Stack Overflow's developer survey, and the most recent one from 2019. If you look it up and just you can search it, Postgres has named again as the second most loved database, and I think that's powerful. But I think what's maybe more powerful is why. What is it about Postgres that makes it so loved by developers? And I think there are a few things that we hear when we talk to developers who use Postgres. And these aren't necessarily in order of importance, but I'll share some comments that we hear. One, Postgres is highly extensible and modular. And I think those qualities, we hear from developers that developers are confident because they know that there are solutions for the unique projects and the unique characteristics of the projects they have somewhere in the Postgres ecosystem and landscape. They're confident they can pick Postgres because they know someone will have tried to use Postgres in a similar context that they are using it in. These are all on top of Postgres being just an extraordinary relational database. The second is Postgres has a community that will engage. If you haven't followed the community and you go and ask a question, try it sometime. The good people in community will work hard to get an answer to people who are curious, who want to know how to use Postgres or have a particularly difficult question. Companies like EDB try to go even further than that by offering structured support and wrap that even into an SLA. But you can get help from the community. One developer said, I like the availability, the wide availability of data types. So that Postgres can be used in different contexts. Document databases have become more important, particularly with the proliferation of unstructured data. So today, Postgres is recognized and respected for its support of JSON-B for that context. But then go beyond that and look at geospatial and PostGIS or time series data. Postgres has the most complete range of data types available so that customers can use a single database to accomplish more. And I think that gets to the last point a little bit, which is that it's a true, full function, general purpose relational database, but with all those extra qualities and attributes, developers who pick Postgres know that when they start their projects, when they don't know exactly where their project will end, they know they can be confident, and they report that we can be confident that Postgres will get us there. And it's interesting because we see more and more companies who've tried a specialty database, and as the project evolved, while those solutions or choices may have been easy at the start, as the needs of the workload evolved faster than the database capabilities that they were using, we see this with Mongo often, then they have to come up with a different choice. And so Postgres is, I think, more and more the choice of developers for this reason, who are looking further forward. And I'm going to come back to talking about some of the specialty databases. And I think that really gets at the heart of Postgres being the ideal choice for enterprises. And I would tell you this, if you aren't using Postgres today and you're running a business of any scale, you need to run Postgres. But I think the question inside, when you look at that, are you able to get the Postgres that you really need? Are you getting the help that you really need? And maybe asked another way, if you're not using Postgres, what technologies are you using today that have the power to be transformative, that have the power to give you legitimate freedom from encumbrances you have with existing vendors and give you the power to transform your economics so that you can invest in the strategies you have to grow and make a healthier company. These times demand, I note it especially now in the economic and health crisis environments we find ourselves in. They demand that we search for better ways to invest in our businesses, and transforming your database to open source and to Postgres is one of those tools. So let me talk a little bit about what we're doing here. Like James Watt, EDB brings power to Postgres. Watt improved on existing technology. He did it to make it more efficient. He supercharged the Industrial Revolution. He supercharged the world economy. And we're here to build Postgres to drive more efficiency and to improve the business models around us and improve those economics in truly transformational way. And when you look back at history, look at Gartner's MQ. On the right, you see the 2019 Magic Quadrant. We're very proud to be part of that group. And when you look on the left, you see some of the companies that were named in 2015, just a few short years ago, companies that were part of Gartner's MQ. And you ask yourself, what happened in the intervening years? There were a total of 31 companies who were prominent not many years ago. And today you see 12. Gartner, I think, rightly says they've zoomed in on the top of the pyramid. And I think that's an accurate depiction. But look at some of the names, and some of these are prominent names that still persist today. But who are the names that you don't see there? We don't see Mongo, we don't see Cloudera. Prominent companies, certainly in the eyes of the stock market. And what's underneath that? And I think we can draw a parallel. What's underneath that is the notion of specialization versus value for the masses. And I think many of the database companies and the databases that we see in history have been and may today still be important specialty databases. And for those specialized use cases and workloads, they actually serve a really important purpose. But the fact is, the degree of specialization limits the actual reach. And that reach is what companies depend on to create transformation, to create the revolution inside the company that actually changes important parts of the business, that changes fundamental economics. And we are entirely and exclusively focused to putting our customers in a position to do that with Postgres. That's the only thing we worry about. And we are proud that Postgres is an extraordinary general purpose database. We think that is the strength. And we will work continuously to keep making it a more and more performant, scalable, and applicable database for a wide range of workloads. But what Postgres isn't is highly specialized or a high specialty database. And we think that's exactly what gives it power. And we think that is the important attribute of the database that we contribute to most. And so we're here to build something greater. Over the last 10 years, so many of you know, I've now been in the company 12 years proudly. We have contributed some of the most significant technical advances to Postgres. We see ourselves as an integral part of a community that is bigger than us. We see ourselves as a contributor to supercharge Postgres, just like James Watt supercharged the steam engine. And what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about that in context. We will continue to invest and contribute to the important technical requirements in Postgres and continue to advance what Postgres does. We will continue to be the technology that adds power to this overall Postgres motion. We love the independent nature of Postgres. We cherish that unique capability and quality of this community. And Postgres, in fact, is built on that collaboration, and it makes Postgres a better database and a better technology. So bear with me. I want to share a video that speaks to this. Gotta love that video. It expresses so well the energy that I think we all have around Postgres. Look, we are here to help you break free from the past. We're here to help you to get the Postgres that you need. We want you to realize real business transformation and also to be part of a movement that helps see the bigger picture, that helps you achieve the future that you want. This is the revolution, and Postgres is winning. Thank you very much. Power to Postgres. Now, for those of you who would like to stay and ask questions, we're going to open this up for Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Ed. And hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So I'm going to go through our questions now and ask some to Ed. We have about 5 minutes to answer these questions. So one of the first ones that came through is regarding open source DB. How is that impacted by compliance and regulatory requirements?
Sorry, Courtney, can you just, I want to make sure I understand the question. Is it about open source or about EDB?
It's about open source.
And I'll repeat the second part of the question, please.
They want to know how open source databases are impacted by compliance and regulatory requirements.
I think, I don't know that there's a unique difference for open source databases. I think, we certainly, in the context of customers, are held to the same kind of compliance requirements and expectations. I mean, we hold ourselves to a fairly high standard as it relates to the security attributes of the database and the data security standards, which I think are common in the industry. So I don't know that it's particularly different for open source, and we routinely address those compliance and regulatory issues. Some are pretty specific, so I know it's a pretty general answer, but the requirements can be very specific. But I think for companies like EDB, that's one of the things that we do that I think adds value, is we're able to address in very specific detail the kind of issues that companies may have to speak to.
Exactly. So another question that came in when you were talking about breaking free from some legacy databases, someone wants to know what the scope of being a PostgreSQL DBA looks like versus being an Oracle DBA.
Yeah, interesting question. So there are people inside EDB who could answer that with much more, I think, insight than me. But what I can tell you is, I think one of the things that we hear from DBAs, interestingly, because the SQL standard is implemented in Postgres probably more completely than in any other database. We see high transportability of skills between database vendors, and it's kind of notable in the Oracle world. We see, because Oracle has they're particularly those who are deep in Oracle PL SQL. Postgres has PLPG SQL. Sometimes with EDB's compatibility, we even smooth that out a little bit, but there's a high intersection between the skills that DBAs use in the proprietary world and the skills they need in Postgres. So we think those skills are, and see routinely, they're pretty highly transportable.
Great. Another question that came.
Sorry, Courtney, just on the other side of that. I mean, that doesn't mean there's not a learning curve. I think Postgres, like any new technology, has some elements of a learning curve. I think part of what we pride ourselves in doing is helping bring DBAs through that.
Great. Another question that just came through after the video that played, they said apparently EDB is rebranding today. They want to know more about what that is all about.
The rebranding is about acknowledging a really important transformation that's happening around us, and also making a bolder statement about what role we see ourselves playing in the future of Postgres, in the future of transformation in the database landscape.
Okay, there was another question that came through. They wanted to know your view on comparing Postgres with distributed databases like Cassandra.
Gosh, that's a big question. So that's one we should probably just take offline. I think that there's so many dimensions of that topic, that are too complex to dive into here.
Someone else just had a comment that they loaded Postgres against SQL Server, and now they can't live without it. They run 2 different warehouses and make Power BI look great with it. So that was just one comment that they wanted to share with you.
Hey, you're not alone. Let me tell you that one of the things we surveyed our customers over the course of the past year, interestingly, we learned from them, surprising to us, and as much as we feel like we have a handle on how Postgres is used in our customer base, 60% of our customers reported that they use Postgres in an analytics context. And I think that was surprising to us. I mean, obviously, there's still a majority of use in the context of systems of record, which we would all think of for Postgres. But you're not alone. There is a wide range of use cases and experiences using Postgres for analytics style workloads, and we love seeing that.
Okay, we have a few more questions that came in, but it looks like we're getting to the top of the hour as well. So I just wanted to let everyone know, we'll definitely look at your questions and follow up with them personally where we can. I also wanted to let you all know that at the top of the hour, we're going to have a 15-minute break before our next session as well. So take that time for yourself, refill your coffee, etc. And we're excited to see you the rest of the day.
Great. Thank you all. Thanks for joining. Thanks for the great questions. Keep the questions rolling. We'll answer them all, the technical ones and the business ones. We're excited to have you here and happy to engage as much as you'd like. Thank you. Stay safe.